Damon, I really like the hands on this. I always think every time I see it, I really.
Good morning, everyone. We're gonna begin shortly at 10 a.m. Please feel free to get ready for our first breakout session of the day. All right, so it's 10 a.m. and I'm pleased to welcome every one of you to the breakout session 1A, reflecting on lessons learned, studying consensus methods in integrated knowledge translation to promote patient-oriented research. My name is Marcelo Bravo, and I'm going to serve today as moderator of this session. There will be a live questions and Q&A section of approximately 10 minutes after the presentation. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions to the speakers. And when asking your questions, you can add in the speaker name or group that the question is directed to. Remember, use the hashtag PPF2022 in your tweets about the conference. We'd like to continue being a good trend in the conference world. And for any technical questions, please go to technical support that can be found toward the bottom of the menu on the left within the conference green and golden platform. Our panel today, reflecting on lessons learned, studying consensus methods in integrated knowledge translation to promote patient-oriented research, discusses methods of engagement driven by questions from the moderator and audience. For experts on consensus building methods, integrated KT, and patient-oriented research, reflect on lessons learned from studying consensus methods in integrated knowledge translation to promote patient-oriented research. The panelist has led a project within one of the BC's regional health authorities, including Interior Health, Northern Health, Fraser Health, and Island Health, on a diverse set of topics ranging from intimate partner violence and acquired brain injury to telerehabilitation and behavioral support transition neighborhoods to rural transport. First, Dr. Carey will discuss the knowledge synthesis activities, specifically the scoping review, which aim to identify and understand how research partnerships define, describe, and implement consensus methods with a focus on issues of inclusions and power dynamics. This is followed by Dr. Plamondon, who will present on the inclusion of patients and community members in consensus methods, specifically deliberative dialogue. Next, Dr. Davina Banner will reflect on the telerehabilitation project conducted in partnership with Northern Health. Finally, Dr. Alke will present on the Intimate Partner and Acquired Brain Injury project conducted in partnership with Island Health, the Behavioral Support Transition Neighborhood project conducted in partnership with Fraser Health, and the Rural Transportation Project conducted in partnership with Interior Health. In addition to sharing key messages from these projects, panelists will share insights about using consensus building methods to support and guide research driven by integrated knowledge translation and patient-oriented research lens. Examples of adapting the research approaches to COVID pandemic, shared learnings, and approaches to knowledge translation will also be provided. I will now pass it over to the panel to begin the conversation and continue with the introductions. Thank you, everyone, for being here today this morning. Over to you.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to Breakout Session 1A. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Prince George, BC, the traditional and unceded territories of the Lheidli T'enneh. I'd also like to acknowledge the research funding support for this work, which was provided by the BC Support Unit Methods Cluster, And I'd encourage everyone here today to acknowledge the traditional territories of where you're each joining us from. If you have any questions, like Marcelo mentioned, there is time built at the end of the presentation. Our panelists will be happy to take them then. So just a brief introduction to our panel today. I'm Damon, one of the postdoctoral fellows on this team, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm joined by panelists and project leads, Dr. Olkey, Carey, Plamdon, and Banner. And before handing it off to Dr. Olkey to provide an overview and introduction to this work, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our wider research team of knowledge users, researchers, trainees, and patient partners from across the province and beyond who have all contributed to this work in many different ways. Over to you, Dr. Olkey.
Thank you, Damon. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nellie Olkey, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded ancestral territory of the Silks people in the Okanagan. So when we started this project, there really was, and still probably is, little information in the literature on how consensus methods have been used, both in integrated knowledge translation and patient-oriented research. And so that was the impetus of the reason for doing this work. We wanted to understand how consensus methods could be used to further integrated knowledge translation and patient-oriented research specifically. So we had, our overall aim was to better understand effective consensus methods for use in IKT and POR. Our objectives were to understand how researchers and research users working in partnership were using consensus methods in their work through a scoping review. And then we were going to compare, contrast, and test different consensus methods within the IKT and POR world. I have to say that this area had changed fairly significantly from what it had initially intended on being due to largely COVID, and also due to some of the climate change hazards that we've experienced as well, particularly in the interior over the last year. So you'll hear more about what we've done, but we did adapt and were flexible throughout the project, and worked under the constraints that we were faced. And lastly, our third objective is to develop guidance that would support IKT researchers and research users in using consensus methods in their work. And I will pass it to Miranda.
Thanks so much, Nellie. So I'm joining today from Victoria, which is on the land of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, and I'm here as an uninvited guest. So to go over the scoping review really quickly, it aligns with our overall aims for the project. So identifying and understanding how research partnerships define, describe, and implement the consensus methods that they want to use, as well as understanding how those partnerships consider and navigate inclusion and power dynamics. So we did a search of 4 databases, and we ended up with 30 studies that we extracted data from. And one of the things we were looking for would be mode of delivery, the actual type of consensus method, the degree of facilitation, benefits and challenges, as well as just how research users or patient partners were included in those methods. So what we found is that around 11 different consensus methods were used, the most common being the Delphi, which was no surprise. There are many variations of the Delphi. And then we also had things like deliberative dialogue and nominal group technique. The issues of inclusion and power dynamics were rarely discussed. And then overall, the reporting was limited not only on the consensus methods or the power dynamics, but also the partnership approaches themselves. In over half the articles, authors provided some sort of explicit definition of partnership or discuss the type of partnership they use. So what I mean by that is, did they use community-based participatory approach, integrated knowledge translation, or patient and public involvement approaches like that. So often there was also a limited definition of what consensus was or what partnership itself was, but enough to still meet our inclusion criteria. So the review extends the literature by providing an overview of the methods as well as how they're used in research partnerships. And then we have submitted this to evidence and policy, and it's currently under review. Damon, next slide, please. So I know this infographic is a bit hard to read, but hopefully it comes out a little clearer if you can zoom in on your own computer. So first and foremost, these are considerations for teams conducting consensus methods. It's not, it's sort of an overview of what we found from the scoping review. It's not meant to be exhaustive or, you know, it's not meant to be a recipe. So these are just things to consider. So one, identifying a diverse and inclusive team of researchers and research users, including patient partners, doctors, whomever fits your research purpose. So, and how they will meaningfully benefit your consensus project. So one example of that is to clearly outline who your partners are and how they will be involved. So in what considerations you made around diversity and inclusion in your partnership. Identifying your approach. So did you use community-based participatory research or integrated knowledge translation or POR? Next, explicitly discuss and transparently report the partnership's decision-making process. So what I mean by that is, you know, how did you decide what consensus is? How did you decide what partnership you were going to choose? Like really outline those decision-making processes. And then next, consider the feasibility, benefits, and challenges of facilitating different consensus methods. So if you choose a Delphi with different variations, what does that look like? So what degree of facilitation do you need? Given COVID, you have to, you know, pivot and use a different mode of delivery, but then always report on that and discuss that. Next, carefully consider the pros and cons of different consensus methods. So, you know, a Delphi can be done somewhat easily, but it's not always going to give you the outcome you want. So does the deliberative dialogue make more sense for the audience you're trying to engage with? And then lastly, reporting guidance needs to be established for consensus methods, both within and outside of research partnership work. So there's some work done on this already, but in terms of, you know, what journals allow and won't allow, really needs to be tightened up. And then also more opportunity for reporting on things, because we know that there's a lot of limitation in terms of word limit in journals. So when possible, create your own reporting checklist and then reporting any procedure deviances. So lastly, an overall effort needs to be made to try and report and be very clear on our worldviews, different issues of equity, power, and inclusion, as well as trying to figure out a tool to help research teams consider all of these things when using different consensus methods. Yeah, and I believe that's it.
All right, so before our panelists have a chance to speak more specifically about each of the projects they led, I'd like to provide you with a brief overview. So Dr. Carey spoke about the scoping review, which was phase 1. In phase 2, we had phase 2A and phase 2B. So first, Dr. Plamadon will speak to the inclusion dialogues in phase 2A. Next, we'll move on to phase 2B, where Dr. Olke will speak to project 1 with Island Health on intimate partner violence and brain injury. And then Dr. Vanna will speak to project 2 on telerehab with Northern Health. There were 2 other projects that were in phase 2B, including Fraser Health and Behavioral Support Transition Neighborhoods, as well as one with Interior Health on rural transport. We'll not be covering those today in the interest of time, but if you would like to learn more, feel free to reach out to any of our panelists. And if you're interested in learning more about Project 3 with Fraser Health on Behavioral Support Transition Neighborhoods, be sure to check out our team poster. It's poster 4. Over to you, Dr. Plamadon.
Thanks. It's nice to be with you all today. I'm Katrina Plamondon. I'm joining you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx people, not so far away from where Nellie is sitting, somewhere in this beautiful valley. And it's nice to see many familiar names in the participant list. So hello to all of you. I'm going to share with you just a very brief overview of what we did and what we heard through a series of deliberative dialogues that really dove a little bit deeper into some of the questions that emerged from the scoping review and supported and extended some of our interest in understanding what makes any kind of consensus method or any kind of engagement in research meaningful and how to be quite inclusive. So we set out in this phase to understand what contributes to a more meaningful experience of inclusion, particularly amongst people who navigate any kind of social exclusion. So we had an invitation that went out through a variety of networks and invited anyone who self-identified it as navigating some form of social exclusion through their social positionality to join us in a series of dialogues. So we had 4 initial deliberative dialogues where 16 people joined us and had really in-depth conversations. In advance of those dialogues, we provided them with a synthesis or summary of some of the findings from the scoping review that really highlighted the absence of attention on decisions about who gets to be included, in what ways, and through what justifications. So we presented that to folks. We invited them to think about their own experiences of participating in research studies or research advisory committees or research systems in some way. And we also invited them to use art to think about their experiences. Those folks came together in a really facilitated and structured environment. Some of them did share their art with others, and we used that art as an opportunity to really spark deep reflection about what are the practices, what are the structures, what are the pieces of experience that make it feel more or less meaningful, more or less tokenized. After we had that first series of 4 dialogues, we synthesized what we heard. We did some qualitative content analysis, and then we brought that to another 2 deliberative dialogues to validate and extend those findings. There were 25 people who participated in those dialogues. And then we've really used quite a participatory approach to making sense of what we heard, and use the process of writing with our broader team, including patient partners, in the conversations about what do these findings actually mean, and what are our recommendations out of that. So this table you see on the right-hand side of your screen around nurturing, welcoming systems, spaces, and relationships, these are our high-level findings. This is what we heard contributes to more meaningful experiences of inclusion. And our findings, I think, do a very good job of challenging and focusing on research systems and the structures within which anyone who is attempting to create an experience of welcome or an experience of inclusion has to navigate in order to do those. So we heard a lot about the challenges of aligning inclusive intentions with the systems and structures that make it difficult to do that. We also heard a lot about the importance of very practical and logistical considerations in creating a very open and welcoming table for people to be at, whatever their needs might be, in order to make that possible. And we heard a lot about the practices and ways in which researchers in particular and research teams build relationships and include relational practices in the work that they're doing. We'll go to the next slide. So we have a series of recommendations. We're just completing a manuscript about this right now. The concluding sort of reflective question we're posing to folks is to consider what the cost of not being inclusive is. And we have some very specific recommendations for research systems and structures. These include things like funding agencies, advisory bodies, research ethics boards, review boards, any policy people who have within their sphere of influence the capacity to create the the conditions within which research unfolds. And then we have specific recommendations for researchers and research teams. These align and extend from what we found in the scoping review, and I think are really complementary to what we heard in the other consensus methods that Nellie will speak to in just a moment. Our next steps include completing our participatory sort of process of writing. We have a few KT products designed, and I think that this will really be a springboard for some very specific kinds of capacity building workshops. I'll turn it over to you, Nellie.
Thank you, Katrina. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Intimate Partner Violence Acquired Brain Injury project that we did in partnership with the Nanaimo Brain Injury Society, as well as Island Health folks. And so really what we were determining or wanting to do is develop some consensus on services and supports that were needed for women experiencing or having experienced IPV and ABI. And services and supports is very broadly defined, could be education awareness or additional research that needed to be looked at as well. So we used a deliberative dialogue approach. We had a face-to-face dialogue in Nanaimo, BC, which very fortunately happened just before COVID. We had 35 participants attend from various different stakeholder groups, including community members with lived experience, community organizations, healthcare organizations, social services, and then also policymakers and local policymakers and civil societies. So we used a variety of different activities with small and large group discussions. We also used, individual reflection before those discussions. And then we also use a democracy approach to develop some priorities. And then we held a follow-up deliberative dialogue in March 2021, which then we had 9 participants attend. You can move the slide forward. So this is a infographic that was developed with the results of the initial deliberative dialogue. And so we co-created actions that included building partnerships, education for providers, which was seen as a really important piece because providers weren't really aware of the link between IPV and ABI. Community awareness and education, and then some integrated wraparound services, and then a large need for research as there was a significant lack of research. In our second deliberative dialogue, we validated those actions, and particularly partnerships was highlighted, education for providers, and the integrated wraparound services. And we added one new action that was around developing appropriate and culturally safe relationships and supports for women. And not only Indigenous women, that certainly was a significant component, but also the fact that new immigrants and other groups don't, their cultures are different, and they may have different beliefs around intimate partner violence as well. You can move the slide forward. So what did we learn? Well, face-to-face dialogue yielded obviously greater participation of a broader group of stakeholders. And so I think that's something to consider, but there are benefits also with, as we'll talk about later, with virtual dialogue. We had no choice in this situation. COVID restrictions were maintained, and we were not able to meet face-to-face. So women who are experiencing IPV and ABI may need additional preparation for their participation. And so this may be everything from having materials circulated earlier so that they have time to read and process those materials. They may need considerations in a virtual setting for on-screen issues, and help with that as well. And then we're also working on KT activities. These are some of the things that we've done. We have the infographic, as you saw. We circulated the action reports for both of the deliberative dialogues, and the last one was a combination of everything. And they were circulated by the Nanaimo Brain Injury Society. And then they also have used the action report to promote action in this area. So meeting with policy and decision makers, so moving things forward. And then we are working on a manuscript on this sub-project with results, with the inclusion of a patient partner co-author as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Nellie. So I'm Davina Banner. I'm a researcher and nurse. I'm based up at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, which is on the ancestral unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. So phase 2B involved a telerehabilitation project that was partnered with Northern Health. And so this project emerged really in response to the pressing and unprecedented challenges arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. In Northern Health, rehabilitation services are typically centred in the regional centre of Prince George, with some distributed services across the region. Just noting that Northern Health is a vast but sparsely populated health region. And so in line with those physical distancing restrictions and increasing deployment of staff and services, we were approached by the leadership of Northern Health to explore the ways in which telerehabilitation services could be developed and supported. To do this, we undertook a deliberative dialogue using a variety of different steps. And so the aim of this was to identify and build consensus on the integration of telerehabilitation services, as well Northern Health were really interested in learning about the development of triage criteria. That is, what patients may benefit most from these services. Through the approach, we conducted a rapid review, which included a review of 30 articles. This generated the evidence to support the dialogue and included the identification that varied technologies could be used for telerehabilitation services. As well, we uncovered various barriers and facilitators, as well as understanding how patients could be assessed for suitability for telerehabilitation services. We then conducted a virtual deliberative dialogue, and 18 participants from diverse stakeholder groups participated. This included a patient partner and other community members, as well as healthcare providers, health system administrators, and other knowledge users. Next slide, please. As part of the process, we engaged in structured conversations and voting activities. When we did this, we found a variety of findings, including the need for accessible and flexible technology, education and support, and optimized and re-envisioned rehabilitation teams, the assessments of the needs and expectations around telerehabilitation and rehabilitation services more broadly, as well as understanding diverse patient, community, and health system requirements. Oh, sorry, could you go back 1 second? When we did this, we did note, however, that we wanted to uncover the triage criteria, that is, who these services may best suit. However, what we learned from the participants is that that was probably one step too far, and that instead there was a need to focus on those baseline supports and infrastructure, an example of which was education and support, which through our voting activities emerged as our primary priority. Examples included the need for deployed and dedicated IT services, as well as a telerehabilitation coordinator that could bridge supports between patients and healthcare providers, dedicated space, as well as other support services, including those that can support cultural sensitive and safe services was needed. Thank you, next slide. So as part of the process, our team are continuing to engage with Northern Health to complete this work. We have a final and follow-up dialogue that's still outstanding and that will be done fairly soon. And we're already engaged in KT. Indeed, we spent a lot of time developing our preparation materials, our action report, which was developed after the first dialogue, as well as other sources such as an infographic and plain language resource. Next slide.
All right, so thank you all for the overview of each of the projects that you co-led. I'd like to now shift gears a little and open up the floor for some discussion. So I'd like to pose a question to you all. to kind of reflect on and share some of your experiences. If you could talk some more about your experiences around the inclusion of patients and community members with lived experience in some of these consensus building activities. So maybe we'll start with Miranda.
Yeah, thanks, Damon. Always love presenting with this group. It's a great group to be a part of, and this research was unique in that I think some of these things that we found in the scoping review around inclusion and power dynamics really we were already doing in our project. And one of the things I'll say around that is for the patient partner in the scoping review, which I didn't mention before, and I'm certainly not speaking on her experience, but my experience of her being part of the project is that she could choose what aspects of the project that she wanted to be a part of. You know, scoping review isn't always the most enlightening thing to be a part of or the most exciting thing, but you know, allowing that agency and that opportunity for her to choose which aspects were really important, in my opinion. And really grateful to have that experience brought to the scoping review in that lens. Yeah.
All right,
Katrina.
maybe we'll move on to Katrina. If you could share some main points from the inclusion dialogues work.
Yeah, thanks. I think the series of dialogues, this inclusion study was really it was a really lovely experience. I think all of us who participated or were able to join one or more of the deliberative dialogues, we learned a lot, and we had some really beautiful and rich conversations. And I think some of the things that stand out to me most are the number of ways in which people in general were constantly asked to overlook or be satisfied with a sort of very superficial level of inclusion, often because of assumptions that that don't always translate. So for example, it really stood out to me. One person talked about how big of a burden it was to participate in a meeting in English because English wasn't their first language. And so the amount of materials that were offered in advance of a meeting, the time and energy it took to review even those materials to prepare for a meeting, let alone sit in that meeting, were often taken for granted. And then during the meetings, the same person commented on feeling like that there was another layer of burden of being expected to speak on behalf of anybody who was other than the dominant group in the room. So anybody other than white. And others shared a similar sort of experience of feeling like they were satisfying some kind of quota or criteria without necessarily being afforded the same considerations. So there were comments shared about thinking about meaningful and respectful and good ways to think about compensation or what the cost is for people to be participating, and also to find ways to create time and space and dedicated budget to make inclusion possible. So another really powerful example was in a workshop. Someone shared a story about a workshop where there were ASL interpreters, so American Sign Language interpreters present, but not enough present for people to participate in conversation, and not enough translators available to enable participation in small group conversations. So 1 or 2 translators were working for 30 people. It doesn't function that way. So if you want an inclusive conversation, there has to be adequate time and attention and energy put into making that like very logistically and practically possible, and not overlooking the costs and burdens that are put on people who are at a time when a rhetoric of equity, diversity, and inclusion is at a heightened level, and there's a lot of interest in it. It's also a time where, without challenging some of the assumptions about what that would require for it to actually be meaningful, risks perpetuating systems that are actually causing more exclusion and just being called something more diverse. Yeah.
Thank you. Over to you, Nellie.
Sure. I think I'll just hone in on one thing that has really, you know it, but you don't know it until it happens, time and time again, is language. And, the importance of plain language or simplicity in presenting information for people who are involved in consensus building, those with community members and patients, those with lived experience. I can speak to just an example from Project 4, where we are doing a Delphi survey and then following up with a deliberative dialogue, where it is, that's a different process, and we need to be really clear. And our patient partner on the team spent a long time in helping us really work the survey so that it was in a format that hopefully would have been more understandable. We did have a few issues, but mostly with the instructions around the Delphi survey. Thanks.
All right, moving on to phase 3 then.
Thanks so much. So phase 3 really comprised the knowledge translation phases, and this was an ongoing process that began at the inception of the project. And our KT goals was really obviously to raise awareness of the priority areas that had been raised by our partners and was the focus of the dialogues, but also to raise awareness and advance the science of consensus methods in patient-oriented research. And as part of that, we wanted to incorporate a really strong patient-oriented lens, as well as that equity-informed approaches to knowledge translation. And so we began planning right from the onset. And our overarching goal is to effectively disseminate the findings, facilitate their mobilization, as well as down the line to evaluate their reach and impact. Next slide, please. So a primary goal for us was that we wanted to make sure that through our work, we were serving diverse audiences that are people with lived experience, patient partners, community members, as well as a wide range of knowledge users, including healthcare providers, health system administrators, policymakers, and also the research community. An example of this included the integration of materials to support meaningful engagement of patients and community members in our dialogue processes. So this included paying attention to how we developed our evidence summaries, as well as the use of plain language resources. And an example of this was a video that was used to prepare participants for a consensus process. That is, it provided a shorter but videoed overview of the project. We also wanted to make sure that our action reports, that is our findings from the results of the dialogues, were also able to be used by a variety of audiences. And so we wanted to make sure that this was the case. And so we engaged our partners, including patient partners and knowledge users, in evaluating these products and helping to shape their development. Next slide, please. So we've had a diverse range of knowledge products so far, and we anticipate that these will continue. These include a doodly video, which tackles the issue of what is a deliberative dialogue. And as part of that, we outline key terminology in using plain language, as well as breaking down the steps of a deliberative dialogue, what to expect, and how they can be used to inform research, practice, and policy. Other tools include infographics. At the heart of this, we wanted to make sure that the KT approaches also reflected a patient-oriented approach. To be able to do this, we engage patient partners across the study as a whole, as well as in each of the projects, and patient partners and knowledge users were engaged from the onset of project planning. Through our KT, we wanted to be sure to explicitly value the experiential knowledge, having attention to what is shared and how it's shared, as well as attention to equity-informed approaches. That is, how products can serve diverse populations, how we use language in a careful and sensitive way, and how we make those tools as accessible as possible, including the use of plain language, and being responsive and tailoring those products to the needs of our target audiences. Thank you.
Great. So just to wrap up, some of the lessons that we did learn, as well as a bit on next steps. So the one thing that we had hoped to study right from the beginning was the benefits to both, comparing face-to-face deliberative dialogue and virtual deliberative dialogue. Well, that happened very much so in a very natural experiment. And so I think recruitment, there might be more challenges for some stakeholder groups to participate in a virtual dialogue, although virtual dialogues allow a broader range of people from different geographies to be able to participate that could maybe not participate if it had to be face-to-face. Also, I think virtual dialogues, just by, again, there are some challenges with that, but we are very consistent and very concise. And so they don't take as long to actually, from a participation perspective. In virtual dialogue and face-to-face both, but particularly virtual, you need a dedicated team with very specific roles. So you need a tech person, one person that is dedicated to technology and ensuring that there are no issues, etc. The other thing that we did was oftentimes put in a support person that participants could connect with and go to a private breakout room if they desired that. So from an inclusion of patients, individuals with lived or living experience, we really need to think about sufficient and appropriate preparation to participate effectively in whatever type of consensus method that you're working on. So making sure that materials are out early enough for the group, that you also do orientation, particularly on virtual, Zoom, that some of our patients and individuals with lived or living experience don't have that tech savvy that they can actually do that. So spending time and doing orientation is an important thing. Support for participation, as Katrina has alluded to, interpreters, sign language interpreters, and providing resources for those people who have disabilities, whether that be a visual disability or a mobility issue. Use plain language in all materials is so critical. And then considering and paying attention to power differentials. And as Miranda and Katrina both outlined, and then casting a wider net for more diversity and inclusion in consensus building on poor research teams. So for our next steps, we will continue with our KT activities, including both publications, resources for researchers, resources for patient partners, and those with lived experience. Thank you.
Thank you, every one of the panelists. Excellent presentations. And we have about 80 minutes for some of the questions that are posed on the Q&A, as well as perhaps sharing some comments. There's a first question, I believe, directed to Miranda Carey or anyone. Could you share more about how you identify the patient partner for the scoping review?
So I'll answer that question just as the team lead. So we recruited a patient partner very early on, as soon as we started our project. And I knew this patient partner, and so I knew what her abilities were and how she often saw things in a very different light, even though she had no research experience. And so she had been involved in previous conversations around different literature reviews and approaches. And so that was why we chose her to be part of the whole team and the whole project, but also specifically she was involved in the scoping review.
Thank you, Nelly, for this explanation. There is questions and answers put directly in the box, but perhaps some of you would like to extend with the deliberative dialogue method. The question is, could you share more about it? What project's goal would this method best suit? I know there is an answer there, but it's open to anyone who would like to speak about deliberative dialogue method.
So I'll talk very briefly that I did put an answer in with just some highlights, and I think the video is a great resource. And there's also quite a few publications available. One is sometimes a little bit tricky to find depending on your library access, but there's a SAGE case study article that goes into quite a bit of depth about the actual, like, how to do one. And some of the publications that will come out of this work, I think, also offer a bit more depth on how we accomplish those deliberative dialogues in the environment. So for Katrina, those might be helpful. I'm not sure how to share this quickly with this group, but you could just email me and I can send you that one SAGE case study methods. But there was also a question that we were just looking at around the Linda Lee is asking, and it sort of ties into this, and the second question from Megan about facilitation. And so this was actually a question that we, as a research team, had a very particular interest in. And so as part of the inclusion studies, that first series of 4 dialogues, we specifically had allocated or sort of designated one of our research team members to be an observer of me while I facilitated, because there's a very, we know that it requires actually quite a sophisticated and specific skill set, and have some ideas, but we hadn't sort of systematically paid attention to it. So part of our writing will include some observations about the patterns and practices that that we engage in, using those observations and also observations of some of the dialogues that Nelly was facilitating. We have slightly different approaches, but there are some very common practices that make it very possible to navigate. So for example, one of the skills that's quite sophisticated and isn't just something that arrives out of nowhere is being able to mitigate and be able to attend to, be observant of, and mitigate power dynamics in the moment. This requires being very observant and using the right kind of questioning and representing and sort of on the spot synthesis as you're facilitating and validating what you're hearing and creating space and opportunity for everyone to be able to speak. And there's challenges with this in Zoom because not everyone will have their camera on, but will know. So this, I guess the short answer in the very little space that we have is that it is actually quite complex. It's very sophisticated. I think that nurses, because we are in our undergraduate training trained to be very attentive to relational practice and relational communication, it situates us well to lean into that, but I think there are very specific facilitative skills that ought not be taken lightly or for granted, but actually require specific training. And both Davina and Nelly will have other things to say about this, I'm sure.
Thank you, Katrina. Yes, over to Nelly or Davina.
Maybe I'll just jump in first, if that's okay, Nelly, and I apologize, I'll be transitioning shortly. I just wanted to recognize as well and build upon what Katrina said, and certainly being an observer and seeing the exceptional relational skills, and Katrina, amazing facilitator of those events. And I think one of the things in the inclusion dialogues is that we knew there was potentially, a sensitivity there about people, not only through their experiences of engagement research, but also that many people were themselves living and facing structural barriers and challenges. And so one of the things is that safe research space. And I think one of the things we did was we did allocate a person that was a support person with a breakout room, so that if we did have participants that, you know, were feeling upset or did need support, we kind of had that process, you know, not only through pre-identified resources that they could access and that were free and accessible, but also that there was a space in the moment that we could address that. And I think, you know, especially in sensitive areas, I think those pieces are vital to the facilitation and vital in the planning stages. And I'll leave that there.
I think just one other thing to add is that it's really from a facilitator perspective, you need to move so quickly so far because it is about, you know, you've got that synthesis that is shared ahead of time. So it's really, you know, touching base a bit on that, but then really co-creating that move to action and strategies to do those actions. And that's, you know, in the deliberative dialogues that I do, oftentimes around, you know, health service delivery change and policy change and things like that. Those are the real critical pieces. And I cannot emphasize the need for a very good team around you, because it isn't just the facilitator. You have to depend on all of those other people. And that is so critical in virtual dialogue, because you can't always figure out exactly what's happening because you can't see people necessarily on the screen, etc. So thank you.
Thank you, Nelly. And unfortunately, we don't have much time. We know there are some other questions that some answers have been provided, as well as there are interesting comments in the chat congratulating or reminding about the meaningful inclusions of patients in our research projects. So thank you everyone for the great discussion. And we have some short housekeeping notes that are going to be in the screen now. And there's going to be 2 full days of collaboration, learning, and opportunities to networking. So this is just the beginning. And really, this is so incredible to hear about these high caliber projects taking place in our province. Really, this is a great beginning of the conference. And thank you all the panelists for this great work, and thank you for the committed audience. So we will have now about 9 minutes for stretches, get some tea, water, etc. And then we'll come back to the breakout sessions 2 series beginning at 11. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Marcelo.
See you, everyone.